Welcome, everyone. I'm Ross, Virginia. I'm the director of Dartmouth's Institute of Arctic Studies and a faculty member in the Department of Environmental Science at Dartmouth College. We're really thrilled to have this opportunity to join with you today to consider the new opportunities for Arctic science policy and diplomacy in the Biden administration. There's so much going on right now. We have three experts joining us today to help unravel where things stand in the Arctic now and how President Biden might provide a forward looking and progressive approach to thinking about Arctic challenges. Today's event is co-sponsored by the Institute of Arctic Studies at the John Sloan Dickey Center for International Understanding, the Wilson Center's Polar Institute, and the University of the Arctic Institute for Arctic Policy. Right at the start, I want to thank Natalie and Sharon and Judith and others at the Dickey Center, the staff, for all their support in setting up this event. It's truly appreciated. We have an A team. So we planned a really terrific dialogue today, and we have three friends and colleagues of mine joining us who have overlapping expertise, as you'll see, in science, international diplomacy, and policy. So I will make a few opening comments to set some context, and then each of our speakers will make a short presentation to set up our discussion. The way this will work is that we'll take questions at the end of the three presentations. So if you look at your Zoom screen at the bottom, there's a Q&A box. And if you click on that, it'll allow you to type in a question, which potentially we'll be able to take on during the discussion section of the presentations. So hopefully that works for everyone, and we really look forward to your questions and hearing from you. Okay, well, when I started working in the Arctic, and you can probably tell it's been a little while, it was very rare to see a news story about the Arctic and Arctic issues. Yet today, the Arctic is news all the time. So right before I got online here, I did a quick search, and first three things that came up, news stories. The changing Bering Sea influences weather far to the south, scientists say. Well, we're talking about the Texas freeze caused by Arctic warming. If that isn't complex, I don't know what is. Another headline, Russia announces Bear Gap missile tests as US bombers deployed in Norway. Seems a little scary to me. And the last one, Alaska court to hear challenges to Arctic oil leases, a major handoff issue from the Trump administration to President Biden. So we're going to see how these things come together, why they're important, and share some views on what this might mean for the Biden administration. Next slide, Natalie. So what is the Arctic? And so quick context here, here's my favorite map of the Arctic, and it's actually a map with the sea ice stripped away, showing the light blue there is the continental shelf, the deep blue in the center is the depths of the Arctic Ocean. Key points here, when we talk about the Arctic, it's an ocean surrounded by land. So ocean issues are really important. The Arctic is warming twice as fast as the rest of the planet. That warming is producing permafrost thaw, declining sea ice, potentially exposing vast resources, oil, gas, minerals, fish. At the same time, the Arctic is a zone of peace, has been called a zone of peace. Can that continue? And the real complexity here is that we actually have 8 nations representing the Arctic. Who are they? And what about all the other nations that see the Arctic as part of their future, their economies, and their development? So I think today we're going to see this quote from Admiral Papp come true. What happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic. So we're really going to be talking about the connectivity between the Arctic and the world to the south and our impact on the peoples and the environment of the Arctic. Next slide. This is the other dimension of the Arctic that we're going to explore. The US is an Arctic nation. We're one of the Arctic 8, but we're an Arctic nation because of that massive blue image there in the center of the slide, that's the state of Alaska. Thank you, Alaska. Okay, so we have two dimensions we need to explore here. The US is part of the International Arctic Community, the Arctic 8, but we're also an Arctic nation, and we have the state of Alaska and its interests within US politics. So the issue about the US and Arctic is twofold and very complex. It's about Alaska, it's about the international community. So today, we're going to turn to the panel to discuss the many opportunities and challenges that are going to face the Biden administration as it formulates a new U.S. Arctic strategy, one that highlights Alaska, its indigenous peoples and their perspectives, and then to explore the global responsibilities we have as an Arctic nation. So we have three really interesting panelists and friends and colleagues joining us today. We have Ambassador Mark Brzezinski, a dear friend and colleague. Mark, Dartmouth class of 1987. That's probably the most important thing to remember about Mark. Government major, but he went on to pursue law degree from the University of Virginia, doctorate in political science from Oxford University. He's held leadership positions in both the Clinton and Obama administrations, among them U.S. Ambassador to Sweden, former executive director of the White House Arctic Executive Steering Committee under Obama. It's the point person for all U.S. activities around Arctic. And he's currently principal of Brzezinski Strategies. Mark was a presidential appointee to the Fulbright Foreign Scholarship Board. And during that time, he spearheaded the formulation, the establishment, really, of the Fulbright Arctic Initiative, which I think will come up today. And from my perspective, it's one of the best examples we have of science diplomacy. Also joining us is Melody Berkins. Melody is from Alaska, from Fairbanks. She attended Yale, and that was too far south for her, so she moved up the road to Dartmouth, where she completed a PhD in polar science. Seeing science diplomacy as key to solving global problems is what keeps Melody moving ahead. She's engaged in many different international networks and is on the governing board of the International Science Council. She's also associate director of the Dickey Center, and she's an adjunct professor of environmental studies. And then finally, joining us from Alaska to keep this legit is my good friend, Dr. Mike Sfraga. Mike's a geographer by training. He served in many leadership roles at Fairbanks, including vice chancellor. He's the founding director of the Polar Institute at the Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. And I know many of you who are following Arctic issues know that the Wilson Center, throughout the last couple of administrations, has really kept the Arctic dialogue going and centered in Washington. It's been a very, very important role for the Wilson Center as the nation's bipartisan think tank. Mike continues as an affiliate faculty at the University of Alaska Fairbanks International Arctic Research Center. So here are the three panelists. They will each make a presentation, and then we'll join together. We'll look at your questions, and then we'll build a conversation and a dialogue around the future of the Arctic and the role of the Biden administration in formulating that. So I believe we're going to start with Ambassador Brzezinski. Mark, welcome. It's always wonderful to have you back at Dartmouth, even if it's by Zoom. And thank you so much for joining us today from the nation's capital.
Thank you, Ross. And good afternoon, everyone from Washington, D.C. I'm so pleased to join my friends, Ross, Virginia, Melody Berkins, and Mike Sfraga. The community which has been focused on the Arctic for so long is actually pretty small. We know each other. These are good friends. And we're all excited because I think that this is one of the issues that is really going to ascend during the Biden administration. And the reasons for that include clearly climate will be one of the central organizing themes of the president's global approach with the appointment of Secretary John Kerry, with the clear messages the Biden administration is projecting by rejoining the Paris Agreement and by making climate an absolute focus of not just some of the agencies, but every single government agency sends a very clear message. And of course, it's not just about climate. It's also about the economy and about sustainable economic development and sustainable and socially responsible economic development. And the Arctic is a big piece of that discussion. And then, of course, it's also about our fellow Arctic countries who are so important to us, our special friends, Canada and the Nordic countries, the strategic conversation that we have underway with Russia. Russia, of course, is going to be the next chair of the Arctic Council. That is so pregnant with possibility. And those and other reasons are why this issue, the Arctic issue, is going to ascend. The timing is right for this conversation, for this panel today. There is increasingly a new reality with the Arctic that has to be addressed. And it's important to remember that the Arctic is simultaneously a strategic challenge and a human challenge. And I'm so glad that my friends Melody and Mike are on this panel because, of course, they represent the Alaska footprint. Alaska is foreshadowing and participating in the changes in the Arctic, as Ross alluded. It is the reason why America is an Arctic country. And if our first priority is the people of the Arctic, well, our Alaskan American citizens are those who are impacted most by the changes. And one statistic that I think too few people know about, and that I didn't know about until I took on the Arctic portfolio under President Obama, is that more than half of all federally recognized Native American tribes are in Alaska and the Arctic. And that piece of the American tapestry, of course, is so important to this conversation. President Obama really, I think, was the first to try to address this new reality in the Arctic. And he did that by creating something called the Arctic Executive Steering Committee. And he created it in the White House. Why did he do that? Well, you see on the screen the slide that lists some, really truly just some, of our national interests in the region. National defense, scientific research, maritime safety, shipping, maritime, indigenous peoples, and many, many others. And by placing an office, by creating a coordinating and supervising operation for the Arctic issue in the White House, he did something important because our government is a vertically integrated infrastructure. And we have more than 25 agencies who have some kind of interest, some kind of footprint in the Arctic, ranging from the Department of Defense and the Coast Guard to the US Department of Agriculture and its work on water and sanitation in Native American areas, the Department of Interior, the Department of Energy, of course, and many, many others. And of all the interests that we have in the Arctic, what the White House does, whether through the National Security Council or the National Economic Council, is to set the priorities and make sure that our government operates along a strategic trajectory. And by creating something a little bit like our National Economic Council, a little bit like our National Security Council, by creating an office on the Arctic, he signaled that there will be a national trajectory to pursue a set strategy on the future of the Arctic, and there will be a person who would be coordinating that strategy among and between all the different federal agencies. Next slide, please. The next slide just captures some of the interrelationships between the different agencies pertaining to science, pertaining to security, pertaining to economic development, and others. And what the Arctic Executive Steering Committee did was really mix and match what our priorities are going to be and how we're going to deploy on them. And I think that we learned something under President Obama, and the fact that the Arctic Executive Steering Committee was housed, not in the National Security Council, despite the security and international aspects of this. It wasn't placed in the National Economic Council, despite the economic and energy development piece of this. It was placed in the Office of Science and Technology Policy, OSTP, to really accentuate the science and stewardship dimension of our footprint in the Arctic. And it was placed there because the overarching thesis of President Obama when it came to his vision on the future of the Arctic is that the looming crisis in the Arctic, the changes in the Arctic, are a tangible preview of the global condition. And that is something that we as Americans, and indeed the entire world, has an interest in knowing about and knowing more about. And how can we deploy collectively to achieve that? And I would just, during our conversation today, I'd love to share with you what it was like to be that person driving that office out of OSTP, out of the Office of Science and Technology Policy. Because in certain ways, it made perfect sense in terms of developing alignments around science between agencies within our country and indeed with countries around the world. But in certain ways, the Arctic Office was placed in what is not truly the motor train in terms of the most powerful focal points in the White House, in the Executive Office of the President, and that primarily is the National Security Council and National Economic Council. By putting it in OSTP, which is a little bit less, it's a little bit more on the margins when it comes to central policy making emanating from the White House, put the Arctic issue at, to me, a slight disadvantage in terms of driving policy and making things happen. We got a lot done out of the Arctic Executive Steering Committee, but I want to report out to you that it would have probably been easier operating that office out of the NSC or out of the NEC, because I can just tell you that when the NSC says something to the agencies, it happens. When the NEC says something to the agencies, it happens. It was a little bit more of a struggle, just in terms of my personal experience operating out of OSTP. Next slide, please. I think there was another slide that captures the science interrelationships. So let me back up for 1 second to the previous slide. I don't know. Let's see. Is there a fourth slide there? No. Okay. Well, yes, there it is. Go back to the one with all the arrows and the lines. The one benefit of operating out of the Office of Science Technology Policy is that, run by Dr. John Holdren, who had a nothing less than absolutely disciplined and exacting understanding of who was talking to whom when it came to federal Arctic research. We were able to develop alignments and get money to pay for new projects and new undertakings pertaining to the Arctic that we couldn't have done otherwise. And this visualization shows why that is so important, because there is such a very dramatically integrated but elaborate set of federal Arctic research undertakings that to really develop a strategy around it took someone who was running the Office of Science and Technology Policy to do that. And so I want to kind of emphasize there was a benefit of working out of the Office of Science and Technology Policy. And this was to provide some coherence, some clarity and a sense of priorities when it comes to federal Arctic research. And we were able to do that. Next slide, please, to the AESC slide. The outcomes of a year and a half operation of the Arctic Executive Steering Committee was that we were able to set priorities and to identify the main ones we would pursue pertaining to energy, pertaining to science and research, pertaining to tribal health. We were able to evaluate progress and track milestones that specific agencies, whether the EPA or the US Department of Agriculture or the DoD, were doing. We were able to advance engagement with other countries, and we were able to support the US chairmanship of the Arctic Council and to set into motion a process by which we would support the chairmanships of other countries of the Arctic Council. So I was proud of what we were able to accomplish. And just in very short form, among the things that we were able to accomplish, we were able to bring the president himself to the Arctic to give high visibility to the Arctic issues. I was surprised by this, but no previous American president had put his 2 feet on Arctic soil up in northern Alaska. And that was able to convey the higher meaning of what is at stake. We were able to do big budget requests when it comes to funding of science on the Arctic, and then other forms of infrastructure and our footprint in the Arctic, including funding of icebreaker building and the like. We were able to hijack various state visits, like, for example, of Justin Trudeau from Canada, of the Nordic leaders to the White House, to really project collaboration and a unity of purpose in terms of the future of the Arctic. And then our capstone was the first ever White House Arctic Science Ministerial, which really created a process with 25 governments that was unprecedented, the mission of which was to continue beyond the Obama administration about a problem that is increasingly global, and that's the Arctic. And so out of that White House Arctic Science Ministerial, we were able to produce an understanding of what is needed in this area. I look forward to talking more about that during the Q&A. Thank you, Ross, for letting me deliver that opening statement.
Thank you again, Mark. That was excellent. And I want to thank you for that leadership, particularly in coordinating and bringing together all the disparate agencies and voices around Arctic issues. That shows the power of that kind of collaboration.
Thank you.
I believe, Melody, are you set to go next?
Possibly. I would have to ask my team whether they are, and if they can put them up, I would be happy to go next.
Okay. We're dealing with the usual Zoom challenges here.
You're good to go, Melody.
Thank you. Can you share? Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Melody.
And if they're not quite right, no worries at all. This happens. So you can go next, the beginning click. So thank you. I wanted to start out. So I'm putting up a picture here to take us back in time just a moment. Ambassador Brzezinski started us right into understanding where we're going to head with the Biden transition and the new ideas going into the Arctic, and a very holistic view. And I'm going to step back just a little bit in time to remember where we were at the end of the last administration, because one of the big pieces we were looking at was in climate globally, was the connection to the Paris Climate Agreement. So in November 2015, and apologies, I had some slide issues, so you're going to see my colleague's computer, but thank you for this. That Secretary Kerry joined and President Obama had us join the climate agreement in Paris in 2015, which tried to set the world on a multilateral, cooperative, science-informed path towards climate greenhouse gas reduction, trying to stay below 1.5, people knowing that wasn't very possible, to 1.5, less than 2 degrees increase around the world, and setting targets by 2030 and 2050. Next animation, next. Then during the Trump administration, many of you remember that one of the first agreements was one of the first announcements was to leave the Paris Climate Agreement. And so this is in July 2017. There were international issues surrounding that leaving. So the announcement came, and it took a little bit of time before the US could leave in force. This was the announcement. It had to happen 3 years after the signing. Next click. And the Trump administration did leave in just November 4th, I believe it was. There was the final with the US leaving the Paris Climate Agreement and not part of the idea that we would move towards climate targets by from 2015 to 2030. But one of the very first executive orders that President Biden did sign on his desk the day of the inauguration was to rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement. So I just want to kind of take you through, in terms of climate, in the grand global sense, science-informed issues of climate, we have had a very different, it's been a bit of a challenge over the last few years for scientists to follow what the larger global policy was. And this, of course, goes to the Arctic. Next slide. And I want to put the framing of the climate in the Arctic in another context for you, and that is the Arctic Council. And again, Ambassador Brzezinski mentioned this, and in fact, probably worked very closely with them. Many of us and my colleagues here have all worked with the Arctic Council in various ways. And why I want to bring this in is because the context of science for climate and science for policy and science for diplomacy in Arctic and climate issues are really focused on the Arctic Council and how it works and brings people together in the Arctic. So the Arctic Council was established in September of 1996 with the Ottawa Declaration. And next click. It is there are 8 Arctic nations. Anyone above the circumpolar north, the Arctic Circle, I think it's 60 degrees, is part of the Arctic nations. But it is also, next click, has the 6 permanent participants, or the indigenous communities who live above that Arctic circles. And that includes the Aleut International Association, the Arctic Athabascan Council, the Gwich'in Council, the Sami Council, the Inuit Circumpolar Council, and the Russian Associated Indigenous Peoples of the Arctic Indigenous Peoples of the North, I should say, RIPON. So it is both the nations and the indigenous people. Next slide, or next click. And the Arctic Council focuses on sustainable development. Next. Environmental protection, next. And partnership, as I mentioned, with the indigenous peoples, next. And it has a focus on inclusive governance, next. And inclusive knowledge, and finally. And it excludes military security. And in the sustainable development and environmental protection is this focus on climate. So I'm setting the stage here that over where science has intersected with policy and diplomacy, we've had some shifts internationally. And the Arctic Council is really a focus for all of these conversations when we get into policy and diplomacy for the North. Next slide. Next click. So going back again, right when we left the Obama administration, we had just finished up, and it was right in the beginning of the Trump administration, science and how administration works with science into climate and policy and diplomacy had come into place with, and I'll just have to say next each time, next. For climate and sustainable development, next. In the Fairbanks Declaration, there was something, one more, sorry. Science, diplomacy, next. And an inclusive approach to this, to climate and sustainable development in science diplomacy, but an inclusive approach in the next shows that why was this inclusive? Well, not only do we have the Arctic Council with the indigenous communities and the nations, but in this agreement on enhancing international Arctic scientific cooperation, Article 9, there was a real focus that not only would climate and sustainable development be looked at with this Obama administration, where Vice President Biden and Secretary Kerry were part of this, but the US was agreeing that traditional and local knowledge from the indigenous communities would be part of climate and sustainable development policy. So we had science, we had the diplomacy piece, and we had a very inclusive approach. Next slide. Next slide. So the next chairman of the Arctic Council, that was the US was the chairman of the Arctic Council, as a 2-year rotating chairmanship, was Finland. So the US was from 2015 to 2017. And the Finland chairmanship went forward very well, but there were some challenges with the US looking at issues of climate. And you may remember that the Finland's Arctic Council had some issues with global tensions because of the word climate change and some of the climate agreements that were going to come out of a declaration from at Finland's final ministerial. Next slide, next click. And then the chairmanship moved to Iceland for the Arctic Council. And in that Arctic Council, at the very beginning, there was the issue of kind of a bit of a challenge for the Arctic community, recognizing there was an interest in purchasing Greenland. And that caused some challenges of trust building and collaboration in the US, just in general with the work of diplomacy in the Arctic. Next slide. But while that was all happening, the Arctic has been a zone of cooperation. I said this, the Arctic Council has come around, was in 1996. It's been working together far before then as a zone of communication, collaboration, inclusion, and peace. And so, but even with all of those happenings between the last administration and the new administration, next, there have been these climate and science diplomacy has been happening in the background. So Professor Virginia said he would mention the Fulbright Arctic Initiative. All three of my colleagues were involved in this, in helping develop this and launching it. And it is one of the, this was launched in 2015, the first Fulbright Arctic Initiative with Professor Virginia and Dr. Sfraga as its leads. And it talked about sustainable development, it talked about climate, it brought scientists from all over the circumpolar north to work together under the Fulbright banner, think together, work together of Arctic challenges, and climate and science were underpinning, and collaborative research, inclusive research were underpinning all of that. Next slide. I'm very proud to be part of a small group at Dartmouth that also works very closely with the U.S. National Science Foundation. So in the background, when all of those other things were happening, some challenges in Arctic cooperation and diplomacy, Dr. Virginia, Dr. Culler here at Dartmouth and others worked with their colleagues in Greenland and Denmark and put together a way, how do we facilitate science cooperation, science diplomacy, science interactions on issues of pressing Greenland by facilitating increased engagement between the research communities of Greenland and the U.S. This happened in the background, very collaborative, inclusive, multilateral, focused on sustainable development, focused on climate issues, and focused on collaborations with the indigenous peoples of Greenland. Next slide. And this was actually also with wonderful colleagues at Dartmouth, with also the indigenous leaders from around the world, and many indigenous leaders and leaders in Alaska, what's still developing is the Lancet Commission on Arctic Health. This is co-led at Dartmouth and with the Inuit Circumpolar Council. And again, the focus is on climate and health, it's on sustainable health, and it's really thinking of these issues facing the North, facing the Arctic, as a collaborative, inclusive, and co-produced knowledge kind of way we move forward. So while we've had these general tensions in the background, we have had at the same time these major national and international initiatives moving forward with those same principles. Next slide. And I wanted to mention that if you jump out of the Arctic, in the background around the world, this work towards inclusive climate science diplomacy and a focus on sustainable development is also happening. As Professor Virginia mentioned, I work with the International Science Council, which has a global reach of scientific unions across the natural, physical, and social sciences. Next slide. A major focus for us is the Sustainable Development Goals, and how does science inform getting to 2030 and sustainability? And if you notice, number 13 of the Sustainable Development Goals is climate action. So, next slide, next click. Most of the folks in these international scientific realms are calling for a climate emergency. Next slide. They're very much focused on science diplomacy. In fact, the EU has focused a major effort on science diplomacy as part of foreign policy. And if you look through the foreign policy of a lot of European nations, it talks about the Arctic, and it talks about science diplomacy, and it talks about issues of climate emergencies. Next slide. And focus on inclusive is, I would say, internationally good, but I would say this is where the Arctic can show the world a thing or two of how you actually co-produce knowledge with indigenous communities and local communities. Next slide. And so finally, I'll just say that this is what came out of, this is the executive order that was signed by President Biden on that first day of his inauguration. It's an executive order tackling the climate crisis at home and abroad. It's about both climate and sustainable development. Next slide. It says, together we must listen to science and meet the moment. Next slide. It says we must put the climate crisis at the center of US foreign policy and national security. Next. And it says in partnership with states, localities, tribes, territories, and others for climate diplomacy. It's already talking about the importance, what we know, that none of this can be done. This science diplomacy is no longer just done in a lab or done with a grant to one institution. This is multilateral. This is working with communities. This is thinking about indigenous knowledge. And this is, and I won't even go into, there are already some great opportunities that are going to be starting in Alaska on this kind of work of co-producing knowledge. So it's, to me, what I see going on in the future for the Biden administration is really this focus on tackling climate and sustainable development as urgent and central, as you've heard from Ambassador Brzezinski, and you're probably going to hear again from Dr. Sbrega. And the approach is going to be science diplomacy, and it's going to be highly inclusive as a matter of just of a course, which I think is a new frame. And I believe the world will, if we can do this right, it will also inform the world's move towards more sustainable development overall. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Melody. That was excellent, showing the progression of thinking around international and cooperation in the Arctic and the opportunities there. So let's turn to our friend in Alaska, in Fairbanks right now, Dr. Mike Sbrega.
Thank you, Ross, Melody, Mark, for kicking off this discussion. These are two tough acts to follow, chaired by my friend Ross, Virginia. But let me give it a shot here as to how we can connect the dots, perhaps. They both have provided for us a lot of information, where we have been, where we are, and perhaps where we are going to go. When I've had the discussions about why the Arctic should be important, why the United States should care, well, anybody in Nebraska should care about the Arctic, while somebody in Africa should care about the Arctic. I have been challenged, frankly, at times to communicate to the administration or members of Congress, not that it is important, but how do I connect it meaningfully to their life work, their perspective? People are busy. They got to get their kids to school. They have jobs. And when you talk to them about climate change or the Arctic, it just doesn't fit into the daily routine sometimes. But it is absolutely central. It is key to the future of our planet. And certainly we care about it because it's our Arctic as well. So on a run one night, I tried to figure out what would be the 7 key drivers. Actually, what would be the key drivers that I could communicate to members of Congress as to why they should care. And as I went through these key issues in the North, I came up with 7 drivers, 7 things and buckets that one should consider. And I'm sure that members of the federal government, state governments, policymakers around the North could see their work in these 7 key drivers. So I'm going to share my screen at the moment, and I am going to share with you not just what I call navigating the Arctic's 7 seas. And yes, it very much is a marketing term, no doubt. But I will tell you that it has at least provided for me and those I've spoken to at least 7 areas to focus on. And I have seen people in hallways in federal buildings who have said 7 Cs. Yes, that means they actually got the concept that it's not inclusive of all issues at play in the Arctic, but at least it framed for them, and it does for me daily. And what I propose to the Biden administration is that use this framework to think about how you make a whole of government approach to the Arctic, maybe even a incremental approach to the government, to a whole of government approach, right? Maybe it's a most of government approach to the Arctic in the early days, and then you build out, because when you're talking about whole of organization approaches, those are really hard. And as those of us in the academy or formerly in the academy knows, it's tough to do a whole of organization, whole of university, whole of government approach. I mean, you can't get faculty to agree sometimes as to what time it is, or you can't get administrators to agree as to what memo should be written. So to have a whole of government approach is tough. But if you think about, in my terms, the 7 core issues at play in the Arctic, I would say to the Biden administration, obviously, number 1 is climate. And as you might imagine, the next 6 will start with a C. There could be 9 Ls, 7 Qs, whatever. But to me, navigating the Arctic's 7 Cs, a play on words, but also a filter through which we can do strategy and then implementation plans, kind of works for me. But as Melody and Mark noted, climate, obviously a driver for this administration. You can't get away from it from all of the issues we talked about. Commodities, a major driver in the North, whether it's oil and gas, rare earths, strategic minerals. commodities drive attraction in the North. If we weren't witnessing the opening of a new ocean, we likely wouldn't see the interest in or the development of commodities in the North. Commerce, a lot of shipping. Now, definitions can be moved around a little bit, but I've used it as in terms of shipping. Lots of commerce happening in the North, mostly along the Northern Sea Route, off the Norwegian coast, but nevertheless, fishing stocks, fishing industry, a blue ocean economy, commerce is another one. Connectivity. People mostly think of broadband. The answer is yes, you should think of broadband, but also think about ways in which we're connected, roads, ports, rail, all of those issues related to the North. Communities. As both Mark, Melody, and Ross have pointed out, our communities are going through incredible change. They are looking to be sustained, but also they would like to get beyond sustained. How do they thrive in a new North? And there are some opportunities there. Cooperation. Everyone here has pointed out the Arctic Council and the high degree of cooperation that is seated within the Arctic Council. But make no mistake, there is competition in the North, mostly security and military competition, but also economic competition. So let me go through these really quickly. So we know all of the issues that are at play related to the climate. So for the Biden administration, how do you best position a special envoy for climate along with an Office of Domestic Climate run by Gina McCarthy? How do you position those two, foreign policy, domestic policy, and look at all climate issues, but in relation to the Arctic, how do you advance a narrative among all federal organizations, federal agencies that works closely, in our case, with the state of Alaska on advancing climate research, climate mitigation, adaptation? To me, that is a more whole of government approach. But if you're going to address climate in the North, and it just can't be Alaska, you have to look at all Arctic nations. But certainly climate is the major driver. My second C, commodities. Pick your favorite commodity. I have a slide that has LNG or fisheries. Pick it. But to me, the Biden administration has some opportunities here. LNG, oil and gas, those will be areas, let's just say, of spirited narrative, at least with the state of Alaska and the federal government, but also globally, right? We're in a transition here. So maybe you transition oil, LNG, but you better have a full portfolio of renewables being invested in and advanced across the United States, certainly here in the state of Alaska as a test bed. But I will tell you that when you look at who owns and produces most of the rare earths and strategic minerals, that is China. And should the United States, in our national security, should the United States rely on a supply chain that is hooked almost inextricably from China? I would argue that in our own national security, we should look at diversifying that and look at it not just from an Alaska perspective or a US perspective. We're talking about the North American Arctic. So think about, for instance, rare earths and strategic minerals being developed wisely with a lot of consultation. But Alaska, Northern Canada, Greenland, these are resource-rich areas, when developed well, could actually take care of our national interests, our allies' national interests, provide good workforce development opportunities, but they must be done in a sustainable way, and that calls for a lot of consultation. So a recommendation to the Biden administration, that's one area that is in our national interest. The North does hold incredible stores, something that should be looked at. Commerce. Well, we know the story of the Northern Sea Route. I won't go into all of it. It will never rival the Suez Canal or the Panama Canal, but it is strategic. When you have now LNG tankers leaving Yamal in the middle of winter and headed to Asian markets, that tells you something about what's emblematic of the New North. It is an open New North. It is a globalized North. And for the Russians over the last 10 years, they went from that, which is the Yamal Peninsula and Yamal LNG, to that in a decade. That's emblematic of the New North. That is the Yamal Peninsula development. So when you think about the New North and energy security for the United States, something for us to consider, that the North will be developed. The question is, how will it be developed? Under what rules of international law will the North be developed? Under what climate and environmental conditions will the North be developed? But you know, the United States does not have an Arctic or a deep draft port in its Arctic. The Alaska doesn't have a port. So we have nothing like Yamal, but more importantly, we have nothing for search and rescue, yes, our national security, our homeland security, support fishermen, search and rescue. I can go on and on. But we simply need a strategic deep draft port in America's Arctic. My recommendation to the Biden administration is you think about that as Arctic Legos. If you to build on the existing infrastructure in Nome, you have a university, an airport, you have Coast Guard assets, you have assets there. But if you continue to build additional assets like a Bering Strait Research Center, my idea, nobody else has advanced that, but the Bering is far more strategic now than it was before. There are a lot of climatological things at play. There's a lot of research to be done, but we also have a lot of maritime traffic. So when you think about infrastructure bills that might go forward under this Biden administration, my recommendation would be that the United States needs a deep draft port. It needs to have multiple investors. It needs to be a public-private partnership, but it needs to look at the whole portfolio for the federal government, from commerce to DOD to Homeland Security to our research endeavors out in that Bering Strait. Our communities, and Ross, I've only got a few slides left. Our communities, well, we know that they are struggling, right? Climate change has certainly brought on incredible change. This is the village of Newtok, which has been partially relocated. So we will see more relocations of northern communities. Melody talked about cooperation. Mark certainly underscored all of that. The cooperation, I won't go over this, but that is something that the Biden administration should build upon. Redouble our efforts in the Arctic. Be engaged at the highest level of the federal government, the Arctic Council. But as Mark said, one of the recommendations I would make really quickly would be to get up and running with proper leadership, perhaps under the National Security Council, the Arctic Executive Steering Committee. If you're talking about a whole of government approach, you should get the whole of government around a table working on a strategy and implementation plans. And that, of course, is both domestic and foreign policy. And Mark, I do like the idea of it being in the national security umbrella as well. Finally, competition. You can look at this, the narrative out there is heavy on the competition right now, and for good reason. This is just one slice of the Arctic, but the Russians certainly have advanced and enhanced their Soviet-era base. They built new bases, and the Northern Sea Route, of course, is so important to the Russians. It really is. 20-25% of their GDP is somehow originated in the Arctic. But I say this Ross, this is the last slide, not a pejorative way. If you're thinking about competition in the Arctic or Russia, US, China dynamics in the Arctic, we should look at where each of these countries come from. So like the Arctic 7 Seas, I have given this dynamic another tagline, right? So I give it in a game analogy. The Russian Federation, about 150 million people, a declining demographic, a lot of oil and gas and resource dependent, a lot of social issues. But to me, again, not pejorative, the Russian Federation is playing the game survivor. Invest in what you have, leverage in what you have across the board, but they're not an integrated economy except for oil and gas and some other commodities. But the country here is, you're talking about a survivor mentality to keep that very large country going, again, not pejorative, whereas China plays the game go. We see this all over the world. These are very purposeful, multi-decadal approaches and strategies and implementations, whether it be Africa or the Arctic, so they can simply outlast and outinvest almost anybody else. But their vision for the Arctic is to influence the discussion around the Arctic. And when you put the Arctic in context for the United States, we are the global power, whether it's national security or economic development. And when we say whole of government approach, what a lot of federal agencies hear, and perhaps rightfully so, is that the new Arctic Ocean is just one more place the United States is stretched. So in some ways, not pejorative, the United States plays the game twister. We've just put another dot on that twister board called the Arctic Ocean, whether it's for our DOD or commerce or research. And so we have to figure out, as the global power, how do we include the Arctic now into this whole of government approach? And so the Biden administration, using the 7 Cs, I would argue, could figure out how each federal organization plays within each of those Cs, so that it's not being pulled apart, but investments can be leveraged, each in those 7 buckets. And Ross, I hope I've tried to weave our colleagues' comments and thoughts into a framework, into a new Biden administration, and not talk so much about the transition from the Trump administration to the Biden administration, but at least give it some context. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. That was excellent. And You did weave a lot together there, and so we can build on that in discussion. I've been getting some questions in. They seem to focus on politics and geopolitics, energy, co-production of knowledge, and sort of U.S. government agency interactions. So these are kinds of questions coming in. I notice we have 10 minutes on the clock here. I don't think that's adequate. I'd like to pull Mike Strega audible and put another 15 minutes in the meter, and so we can go to 5:15. I'm letting the staff know. I think that should be fine. So let's get started here. Mark, maybe this is one for you. Question is, Sweden recently approved a 40% increase in its defense budget for the coming 5 years. How have perceptions of security challenges changed in that country and across the Nordic region since you were ambassador there? When Sweden starts spending more on defense, and Arctic is mentioned, that means something, doesn't it?
It does, Ross. And let's go right to the core of what that question's about. And that question's about Russia. So we can end up either in cooperation or in competition with Russia as it pertains to the Arctic. Obviously, cooperation is the preferred outcome. But if countries like Sweden, but also us, Canada, the other Nordics, do nothing to understand and then to carefully position themselves and ourselves in this zone that has been really characterized by peace, even during hostile periods between our countries over time, then we could end up again with competition or hostility as the outcome. One takeaway I had from my time in government was really the lack of clarity, Ross, regarding Russia's activity in the Arctic. Exactly what are they doing there? And I think that there is a little bit of a uncertainty even in Russia's own mind in terms of what they want to do with the Arctic. They do see the Arctic, though, as really a zone of preponderance for them. That's important. They are not just a participant in the Arctic dialogue. Putin, the Kremlin, very much see the Arctic as a place where Russia is preponderant, whether it's resource exploitation or commodities, as Mike put it in his excellent presentation, or it's a security footprint to further move closer to North America. It's not clear. And therefore, when people ask the question, are we looking at balancing what the Russians are doing? Are we looking at offsetting it? We don't yet, as a country, America, have a clear answer, but it's worth really considering this. And I hope the Biden team does, because while some say don't exaggerate what the Russians are doing, others are asking correctly, could they outflank us? So again, I don't think we know whether Russia's claim is a resource claim or it's a strategic claim to control shipping lanes or mineral exploration by others for a payoff, but it is really timely for there to be an assessment of Russia's role. Are they, the core questions of which would be, if I were at the CIA under Bill Burns now, are the Russians likely to be competitive or constructive or both, or negative, self-centered or destructive? It's an open question. And we should be open to looking at other countries, like, for example, the Nordics or Canada, who could be interested in joining us in such an assessment. And I'll close by simply talking a little bit about China and the Arctic, because China is increasingly invoked when it comes to the Arctic. It is my assessment that China has a more generalized, not as specific interest in the Arctic. They have an interest in the Arctic, but it's more generalized. Why is that an opportunity for America? Because countries that have a generalized interest in something, as opposed to a specific interest in something, are more easily shaped by us. And that's a strategic opportunity. And when we did the White House Arctic Science Ministerial, and when we invited 25 governments, we did so with a view of trying to shape some of the countries with a generalized interest in the Arctic towards what we want to do, because they're devoting resources. They just aren't completely certain as to what to do. Well, then why don't you come join us?
Thank you, Mark. I was listening to Mike's comments on the 7 Cs. I thought one of them might be China. I mean, I think there would be people that would suggest that it could be on that list, given uncertainty and the position it may play in the future of the whole region. So Let me move on to a different question here. I have a question. I suspect this, I'll put this out to Melody. I think it could be one of your students even, perhaps. But it's a question about your mention of the importance of co-production of knowledge in Alaska, but across the Arctic more generally. And this person wanted to know if you could expand a little bit on what that is and how do people become engaged in that kind of work?
I would want what I was about to use as an example. I'm just so excited to see that the U.S. has invested $50 million in Alaska and recognized Alaska's leadership in this work of recognizing the needs for Indigenous knowledge and science research, traditional science research communities to come together. And there's going to be a Navigating the New North community office in Alaska that is also working with, I think, the University of Alaska Anchorage, Fairbanks, and I think Colorado is part of it. And they're looking at having a research advisory board and an Indigenous advisory board, working with all of the U.S. Arctic organizations and thinking about the future of the Arctic in Alaska by combining the knowledge and having guiding principles that recognize and support and include and respect Indigenous knowledge as part of that new research community. So it's not a sideline, it's actually embedded in the research process. And to me, that's a much more inclusive way to do science and research in the Arctic. And so Alaska is, to me, leading on that with this new NSF office. We saw that with the U.S. Cold Regions Research and Engineering Laboratory here in Hanover, also has an office up in Alaska. When I grew up in Fairbanks, I knew it well. And they are working with communities and Indigenous communities and traditional knowledge and community knowledge in Alaska to make sure that their engineering efforts are not just out of a box for somewhere in a city, but actually thinking about the knowledge and the Indigenous cultures of Alaska to bring that knowledge into communities and have it work and work better. It's not just fitting, it's actually finding the innovation of Indigenous communities in the Arctic and applying it to some of our Western issues as well. So Alaska is a place that's being done. The Arctic is a place that's being done. And there not only is the Arctic Council an example of that kind of work, that co-production of knowledge, but as I said, it's happening in Alaska, it's happening throughout Canada, it's happening in Greenland, and the U.S. is part of that and learning from it. And so if people want some opportunities of how to get involved, there's a lot you can search on the web, but I think there's more and more opportunities. And I think this administration, I'm excited to see that it will start pushing that as a standard for how we think about moving knowledge forward in the Arctic, that it has to be inclusive, co-produced, and thinking about the people who live there, the Indigenous communities of the North.
Thank you, Melody. I have a comment here actually coming from the Wilson Center. If there's a way for the Dartmouth team to allow all the full panel and myself to be on the screen at one time so they can kind of feel a bit more of interaction here and see what we're doing. So if that's possible, let's try to go for that. Mike, I've been getting a number of questions about Alaska, climate change, energy, clearly the tension between oil and gas development as seen from within Alaska and the sort of stakeholders that are taking more of a global change kind of approach to climate change, those that are coming out of the NGO community, those that are backing the Paris Climate Accord. You live there, you see that tension all the time. I know you've run events on that, but can you talk about whether we'll see more progressive action this person proposes coming out of Biden than we've seen in the past? And how will this play within Alaska? How's this going to work out? Simple question.
Yeah, it's a great question because Alaska is oil dependent, right? We built an economy for the last 50 years on basically one commodity. So an economy equals almost one commodity. And now that commodity obviously is responsible for heating of our atmosphere, all the things we know about. But nevertheless, a state is almost totally dependent, like some other nations, on one commodity. We've never diversified our economy in the state of Alaska. There's very little value add to our economy. And I think everyone knows whether you're an R or a D. You may not say it out loud, in Mike's opinion, but there must be an energy revolution. And I think Alaska has some good stories to tell and some good work that has been done. Alaska Center for Energy and Power, investments in renewables. If you can make it work in Alaska, you can make it work almost anywhere. So geothermal, solar, wind, tidal. But it's a much bigger issue. Here you have a state that is almost absolutely dependent upon oil, a military component of our state, very significant investment there, and a university. Other than that, you have federal spending, oil and gas, and a university spending. And it's going to be, I think, a while until the state is diversified enough that it can stand alone without just oil. And it's an amazing dichotomy. It's in real time. And I don't have a real answer aside from the Biden administration is going to have to work with the state of Alaska, I think, and with our delegation to figure out ways that we can agree upon some things. That climate change is real. It is rapid and it is relentless. And we are seeing it under our feet here, literally. Invest in research, invest in renewables, invest in a transition of an economy in our state. But there is no doubt that it is a big part of our state. It is a big part of our Alaska Native Corporation's portfolio. And our Alaska Native Corporation's portfolio is somewhere between 20 and 25% of the state's generated GDP, somewhere in there. So this is not a yes or a no or a very easy answer. It's going to be a recognition that climate is real. You have to diversify an economy. You can see the trends of other big oil companies where they are moving into more renewables. We have to make that happen, but you simply can't cut off the oil spigot here in the state of Alaska. This economy will absolutely collapse. There's no other industry as large to support a diversified economy. And that money goes into the coffers of the state and it gets doled out to Department of Transportation, a university system, health and social services, other issues. So it's really complex. There isn't a turnaround answer in the short term, although there must be one for the mid and the long term.
Hey, Ross, it's Mark here. Can I also add to that question? To what Mike
Please, Mark, please.
This is really more of a personal story, but it answers the question that you asked about Alaska and its relationship with Washington, D.C., which is 4,000 plus miles away from the capital of Alaska. When I was finishing up as the United States ambassador to Sweden, and President Obama came to me and said, would you come to the White House and stand up this new office that will serve as a focal point on the Arctic? I went to my late father, the National Security Advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, and I asked him for advice. And my father said to me, Mark, I know you care about the Arctic, about the people of the Arctic and the environment, but don't do this job. Don't take this job. And I said, Dad, why? And he goes, because the Alaskans will never embrace you. You will never get any cooperation. There's too much of a valley between Washington and Alaska for you to really break bread for a progressive Democratic administration with Alaska. And in one of the few times of my life, my father was absolutely wrong. In a year and a half, the Obama administration was able to break bread with really the leadership from the town level to the native corporation level to the state level to federal representatives of Alaska. We developed a great dialogue with Senators Murkowski and Sullivan, with Governor Bill Walker, the Malott family, my heroes, Julie Kitka, the head of the Alaska Federation of Natives, and many, many others. And this is in many ways thanks to people who served as kind of great intermediaries between the two areas, like Mike Sfraga. And we were able to produce a lot of wins. And despite the huge gulf in perspectives between people in Alaska, as Mike was alluding to, the natural resources based economy, and what Washington, as this nation's capital, has in mind in terms of Arctic as part of the piece of the future of this world. And so I wanted to offer that up because it was something I had to think about before I took that job focusing on the future of the Arctic.
Mark, thank you. That's an amazing story and a lesson learned that you can bridge these issues with hard work and good people and the resources to make that happen. I have a question here that kind of ties into the Arctic Council. Everyone's sort of touched on that. So any of you that have some perspective on this question, and we've been sort of emphasizing the Arctic 8 and cooperation among these nations through Arctic Council, but there are a lot of non-Arctic states that are interested in the Arctic region. And how should the Biden administration foster these non-Arctic U.S. Collaborations or interactions, countries that have some interest in the Arctic but are not fully represented in the Arctic Council? Should we do anything here or not? Is there a desire to build upon, for example, the Arctic Science Ministerial process to more fully engage with countries from outside the region on issues where cooperation might be possible? So that's to anybody, I think.
Well, Mark, Melody,
Mike, I'm looking at you.
So I can just jump in, first of all, just in terms of the Arctic, because things are being decided about the Arctic that could impinge on U.S. interests when it comes to the Arctic Council. And as Melody mentioned, the institution is more than 2 decades old. Russia is about to take over the chairmanship of the Arctic Council. We will learn a lot during that chairmanship in terms of the possibilities when it comes to leadership and breaking bread and shared and conflicting interests when it comes to the future of the Arctic. After all, with regard to any strategic relationship, there are shared interests and there are competing interests. Can we somehow break bread on the shared interests on the future of the Arctic? I think it's relevant that there have been really, in its 25 plus year existence, there really have been only, I think, 5 agreements out of the Arctic Council. That's actually not that many when it comes to some places changing as much as the Arctic. On the leadership side, I don't think, Ross, correct me if I'm wrong, but there's never been a head of state meeting convened by the Arctic Council. Is that correct, Ross?
That is correct. It was spoken of, but couldn't be pulled together.
I mean, I'm just brainstorming here, but what a move it could be if Russian President Putin convened the first head of state meeting around a set of truly shared interests and managed to bury the hatchet when it comes to things that we disagree on, or at least maybe be even accommodating on that, and convene the Arctic countries' leadership and from that, the world around what is at stake here. And what is at stake here, make no mistake, is the life and the world our children's children will inherit. Because what's happening in the Arctic, as Mike put it, doesn't stay in the Arctic. It affects us in the 4 corners of the globe. And our children are inheriting a world where cities along the coast are literally contracting because of what is happening in the Arctic.
Mark, maybe I just follow up with a comment here, and Ross, let us know if time is ticking out, and leave it for Melody as well. But Mark raises a really interesting question. If a number of us 5-10 years ago in Arctic meetings, whether they're closed door or in public, talked about the Arctic as a zone of peace and cooperation and almost this Arctic exceptionalism. And what you see is now with the invasion of Crimea and other external issues, you now hear Crimea, Syria, you hear other parts of the world creeping into Arctic discussions. So it's not as exceptional as it had been before. And I wonder to what degree other politics could be set aside to actually accomplish the very good thing Mark is crafting here, is that could you actually get past other geopolitical issues to have a very worthwhile and I would say necessary discussion at that high level to consider the Arctic and all of the different facets that we've talked about here. But boy, that fits right into Melody's work in science diplomacy.
Well, thank you. Very good. That was a nice segue. And I was going to say yes. And I know I actually saw one of a comment come in that just said, is this just about the science and the social sciences, the natural sciences? And this is really not, this is about people. What I think if other folks want to work with the Biden administration around the Arctic and they're not part of the current Arctic Council. I think my suggestion, my hope for the Biden administration is to always think first about the people of the Arctic. This isn't something we should be doing to the Arctic. We should be learning from the Arctic. We should be listening and co-producing the next steps with Arctic peoples, Arctic residents. And that means understanding and being more thoughtful of culture and history and the arts and humanities that are part of we talk about geopolitics, we talk about science and climate change, but if we're not talking and centering our conversations around the people of the Arctic and what they want for their future and how we're listening and supporting that in Russia and Canada, in Greenland, everywhere, I hope this administration realizes it's not doing the job it needs to do. That's how we have lasting peace. That's how we have collaboration and communication, is when we really focus on the people and the people's, what the people want for the future, for their peace and security. So I hope we can focus on the people, and then the Biden administration can make those decisions on who it brings in and how it brings them in through something like the Arctic Council and respects those relationships.
And
thank you, Melody.
And make no mistake, the Arctic issue is being increasingly politicized. We saw that, especially under the Trump administration, and the ramifications of that are important because the politicization of the Arctic issue and the problems truly becomes a real handicap to international cooperation.
Well, Melody, that was an excellent sort of closing comment. I wonder, Mark and Mike, if you have a brief statement. We're going to about wrap up here, but I wanted to see if there's something that you want to finish with, and then I'll close up the event.
Go ahead, Mike. I'll follow you.
Well, I was going to follow Melody's, and I'll use this as a closing statement, is that I think out of many of the issues that the Biden administration has to advance, a place that provides diplomacy, critical work to be done on climate, on social issues, economic, political, across the spectrum, a redoubling of efforts and support of the Arctic Research Commission, the U.S. Arctic Research Commission, I think is imperative. The Interagency Arctic Policy Research Committee, imperative. The Arctic Executive Steering Committee, imperative. But there might be some traction across all 8 nations and non-Arctic nations when it comes to research, international research in the Arctic, and leverage that to understand the Arctic better, to come up with sound policies based on research and science, but also as a diplomatic lever across all issues, including the social implications, the human implications, the political and economic implications of the Arctic.
I'll simply close by mentioning that it was my hope when we did the White House Arctic Science Ministerial with 25 governments at the White House in September 2016 that the process would continue. And now we have 2 follow-on Arctic Science Ministerials hosted overseas by foreign governments. And I think the output of that is global recognition that we have a growing problem on our hands, which we can only resolve with growing participation in who addresses it. Hence the participation in the Arctic Science Ministerial of non-Arctic countries. And so what we experimented with was creating a process to come together. We needed harmony, given that the region that we're dealing with is not just ours. We can't just have one country dictate to everyone else what is needed. And the point is that the process worked. It developed a harmonious process of developing alignment. It is my hope that the Biden administration will continue something like that. I very much believe that it will. And that's why I'm optimistic about the future of the Arctic.
Thank you, Mark. I want to thank Melody and Mark and Mike for their wisdom, their forward-looking views around the Arctic, and for joining us and for their attention and everything they've done on behalf of the Arctic. Clearly, the Arctic is a homeland, and we all have a responsibility as Arctic citizens to care and think and support the sustainable future for the peoples of the Arctic. And Melody spoke to that so well. I think the ways that we do this is through international cooperation. It's by improving opportunities within the state of Alaska, our Arctic. And it's come up that can be complex at times, but I hope that the Biden administration works to find ways to bridge that valley that Mark talked about and keep a positive outlook for both Alaska, but also the Arctic more generally. Clearly, we needed even more time than this. I think what we need to do is get together a little while down the road here and see where we are and what things have been picked up or not, and provide another evaluation here on where the Biden administration is moving ahead on the Arctic. I want to close just with a quick statement. A good colleague and someone I've learned so much from is Sheila Watt-Cloutier, Inuit global leader from Canada, who is part of the Lancet Commission as well. And she has a great book. It's called The Right to Be Cold. And I suggest that people pick that up. And if you want to get the human approach, Melody has it right there. Yeah, excellent. We didn't plan that, by the way. But here's this. I think this says it all right here. And she's talking about the perspectives of her people, the Indigenous peoples of the Canadian Arctic. What happens in the Arctic is important to all of us. The Arctic is indeed the health barometer, the early warning for the rest of the world. So these issues matter. We'll bring them forward again as we can. Please stay in touch with us. There are a number of great events coming up through the Wilson Center. And so if you're not on their mailing list yet, the Wilson Center Polar Institute, you really should be. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank the Dickey staff for their great support. Stay well, everyone. Mark, great to see you. Mike, stay warm. Melody, see you at work. Bye, everyone.
Thank you, friends. Thank you.